So, I kind of sat down in Vegas. It's always interesting doing sermon prep in Vegas. That's kind of a a weird place to be. But I was looking and kind of laying out kind of where we're going through Genesis, and the plan is we're going to be going through Genesis and into Exodus to where God gives the law. And then that's going to transition us to Easter, where we're going to look at how Jesus is the fulfillment of that law, right? And how and it is the fulfillment. It doesn't overthrow all of that. It just reveals and shows it to us in a different way of how we live out that law. And the hard part is there's so many things in Genesis and Exodus and all of these. I mean, you could spend years just going through and hitting, and there's some really fascinating stuff. And so trying to figure out exactly what we're going to hit is a little bit difficult. And so there will be some things that I skip over, but one that I couldn't skip over, and I've actually become more fascinated with this story in many ways because it is so challenging. And so we're going to be in Genesis chapter 22. And this is the testing of Abraham. So if you know where this is going, this is a challenging story. That Abraham is asked by God to sacrifice his son in a very real way. So let's just read the story, and then we're going to get into that today. So Genesis chapter 22 says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham, here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, 'Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you.' Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son, Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, 'Father?' 'Yes, my son,' Abraham replied. 'The fire and wood are here,' Isaac said, 'but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham answered, 'God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.' And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there, arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy,' he said. 'Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son.' Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by his horns. He went over, took the ram, sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, 'The Lord will provide.' And to this day it is said, 'On the mountainside of the Lord it will be provided.' The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, 'I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me.' Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba." All right. So, if we focus on the ending, everything is pretty good, right? The covenant is restored and renewed. God and Abraham are closer than ever, if you will. Everything seems to be moving in the right direction. But if we think about this story, it's a little disturbing, right? This is a tough one, and whenever I kind of, as a kid, I remember hearing this story, and kind of the focus is, look how faithful Abraham is, right? And that is true in a sense, right? And so we talk about that, but then as you become a parent and as you get older, you continue to read this story, you're like, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? And I think one time when it really hit me is this story has been used by people who are arguing against God as what kind of a God would do this, right? You say you have a loving God, and here he is asking someone to sacrifice their son, right? How can you rationalize that? Well, in one way, we can't, right? It's like, well, I don't know exactly, And then I've heard this used sarcastically in kind of comedic terms. God asking Abraham to sacrifice the son. So people have a hard time with this, and I want to look at it today because it's really it's a very important story. And let me sum up some of this by this. The reason that we have a problem with this story today is because this story happened. All right? You look through history, human sacrifice has been fairly rampant. All right? Now, we are so far removed from this. Remember, this is happening thousands of years ago. Right? But human sacrifice would have been the norm. So like today, if God spoke to you and you knew it was God, and he said, all right, I think it's time for you to sacrifice your child. You go, what? How could that possibly be? 4,000 years ago, you would hear that and you'd go, well, that's kind of like every other God. I guess that's what we do. Right? It's hard for us to wrap our minds around that. There is strong evidence of human sacrifices in China. There's evidence of sacrifices in the Middle East. In fact, I was looking at this, and this is really fascinating. Again, because I think one of the problems we have is we're like, why would Abraham even consider going along with this? Why wouldn't he even kind of discuss? Like he discussed with God about God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's not going to discuss with God about this, right? Well, maybe because it was so commonplace that it was kind of expected, right? This is written, it says new findings, and remember where Abraham came from? Anybody remember? Real long word? Yes, exactly. It says new findings are also overturning some previous interpretations of sacrifice. One example concerns the royal cemetery of in which is now Iraq. That would be the exact place, which dates to sometime around 2500 BC, right? Which Abraham probably would have predated that. So this would be, the 2500 BC would be after Abraham, probably. I'd have to look at my numbers real quick, but it says, but it was excavated in the 1920s. The site contains tombs of ruling class people, some of them buried with treasures, and as many as 74 other people. The later apparently died to accompany the elites into the afterlife, presumably to serve them. It says some of them would look like they were poisoned, but many of the skeletons in has shown that at least some of these people were killed by a blow to the head and were not perhaps willing victims. All right, so that is going on in the place where Abraham grew up, around the time period that Abraham would have been around. It would have been common. All right, that's, again, hard for us to imagine. But you look, and we live in such a weird place now. This is not picking on one race or the other. Like I said, major areas in China, major areas in the Middle East, major areas in what we now know as Europe, and the Celtic traditions in Britannia, long time ago, there's evidence of human sacrifices. You look at what Rome did 2,000 years after this time, throwing people into the lions is kind of a human sacrifice, right? And we can say, well, yes, but things just naturally, we moved past all of that. I'm not so sure. I think maybe by God doing this and implanting the importance of not sacrificing humans, which, by the way, when he gives the law in Exodus, it's very explicit, but he's starting that right here. And what is Abraham supposed to be doing? He's starting a people who's going to share God's desires with the rest of the world, right? So God is starting that with Abraham. The rest of the world hadn't really picked up on it yet, right? The Americas, right? And we think, well, that's just back in the BC. There were human sacrifices going on in North and South America up until the colonization happened, right? Now, so this is not an isolated case. It was normal, okay? And that is weird, and we don't get it. But what God is doing, and I think one of the main things that God is doing with this story, we read it and we're like, how could you possibly ask Abraham to do that? Back then, that God was basically asking Abraham, hey, are you willing to do what all these other people are doing for their fake gods? Right? Hey, are you willing to do that? And Abraham was. And then God said, that's not how we're going to do it. That is not acceptable. Right? And he starts to change that practice. Right? And so I think that's a lot about what's going on here, is that clearly God does not condone human sacrifice. It is very obvious. But the way that he is going about it, and we can sit here and we can say, well, he could have gone about it differently or whatever. No, it was a test of Abraham. It was, Abraham, do you love me like these other people love their pagan gods? Because they're willing to sacrifice people to them, and those gods aren't even real. Are you willing to do that? And Abraham, and I love reading that. If you read it a few times, you pick up on little things. Abraham, from the very beginning, he doesn't question God, but you can tell he knows that this doesn't make sense, right? He even tells the servants, he says, we're going to go up to the mountain and we're going to come back down, right? But so he knows that God's got something in store, and he's going to trust God no matter what, right? And it's an amazing show of faith for Abraham, because he's not just ending his son, right? That's part of that's horrendous, right? But what God is technically asking him to do is, God is saying, okay, remember whenever I called you out of Ur, and I told you to come to this new place, which would have been very difficult and not a smart thing to do at all. But you did that, and I told you that you would do that, and then I would make a great people from you, right? That's kind of the to use a popular phrase, that's the quid pro quo that's going on, right? Right? So God says, you go and be faithful to what I say, and you know what? I'm going to bless you and bless your family. Right? Well, by Abraham killing his only son, what is that doing? It's basically saying, okay, I guess I'm giving up all of that promise of using my family to bless the world. I guess you're going a different direction. So Abraham, not only is he showing a willingness to do as the rest of the culture does, and to actually offer a human sacrifice to the God that he believes in, he's also saying, well, you know what? I guess God has a different plan, and I'm not going to receive those blessings that he has been telling me that I'm going to receive. Abraham is showing a tremendous amount of faith, right? And I think Abraham is kind of conflicted inside, because I think he believes God's not going to do this. But he's like, but if he's asking me to do it, even though I don't understand it and it doesn't make sense, you know what? I'm still going to go through with it, right? And this is extreme. It's extreme for us. Again, try to put yourself 4,000 years ago. It's not quite as extreme. That's really hard for us to wrap our minds around. But this was a normal way that you would interact with your God, right? But it's a son that he loves. And isn't it interesting that God, even in speaking to Abraham, says, take your son, the one that you love, right? And offer him as a sacrifice. And of course, I can't help but think, if you really zoom back on this, what is this picturing down the road? Who gives up his one and only son and sacrifices his one and only son for us, right? Even though he knows, God knows how hard and painful that is. That's why he stopped Abraham, right? And it's this unbelievable picture of sacrifice. And for us today, I think about it, and I think, what are we willing to sacrifice? See, following God has always requires some level of sacrifice. It always does. You know, Abraham was willing to sacrifice everything. He was willing to sacrifice even the benefits of trusting God, right? You know, I think it's important for us to think about, what are we sacrificing? You know, and thankfully, God is not going to ask you to sacrifice something so extreme, right? But he does ask us to sacrifice. If we're truly going to follow and to believe in who God says he is and what he wants for us, there are things that we're going to have to sacrifice. We have to sacrifice time. We have to sacrifice lifestyle. We have to sacrifice, you know, kind of the way that we view the world. And I wonder if we're in an interesting place, because we are so blessed as a people, right? To be born in the time frame that all of us have been born in the place that all of us have been born in, right? We are all so blessed, right? It is unbelievable. And you know, frankly, you can live a really strong or a perceived strong Christian life and never really sacrifice anything, right? You know, and that's okay. You know, we don't need to feel guilty about that. But I think sometimes what it's made us do is that, man, we're not even willing to sacrifice bad habits or you know, certain behaviors, right? Are we willing to actually sacrifice those things so that we live the life that God has called us to live? You know, and down the road, who knows? We may be called to sacrifice even more. There's lots of Christians in the world today that sacrifice a whole lot for believing in Christ. You look at what's happening in Iran, and you look at what's happening in, there's numerous places, some of the things that ISIS did in Iraq to the Christians there. You know, it doesn't make our papers for whatever reason, right? There are many Christians who are losing their life, who are willing to sacrifice their life today in 2020, right? Sacrifice is always a part of a relationship with God. And sometimes we're a little uncomfortable with that. And I think it's important that we start thinking about and looking inside, saying, God, what do I need to sacrifice? What comfort, what behavior, what relationship, what may it be that I need to sacrifice in order to show and in order to strengthen my faith in you? I encourage you to be thinking about that. Think about, what is God calling you to sacrifice? And here's the great thing, is even as extreme as this story is, God calling Abraham to sacrifice his son. When Abraham shows his willingness to do so, what does God do? He intervenes, right? He stops Abraham. He provides an alternative, and then he reinforces the blessings that he has for Abraham. You know, whenever we truly are willing to sacrifice, sometimes we get an even clearer picture of the blessings of God. That we realize, yes, now I know what God means when he says he truly loves me, what that truly means. But we have to be willing to sacrifice, be willing to bend our will towards his. Right? And that's not always easy. In fact, very rarely is it easy. But man, there can be beauty on the other side of that willingness to sacrifice. I encourage you to ask God what he is calling you to sacrifice and to trust him enough to do it. And I promise you'll experience the blessings that you never thought possible. Let's go to him in prayer.